We have a guest of honor, Naomi Klein. Thank you for being here with us. At Actes Sud, you published this book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism and Climate Change. You are in Paris on the occasion of COP21. Even though you don't follow the debates like Jade and other journalists, you are aware of what's going on. So the first question that we want to put to you, so despite all of the expectations, people have said that this COP21 arrived at a belated time. But today, on Sunday, can you see some hope?
You know, I think that the extent to which governments are coming to the table here in Paris with some kind of emission reduction targets that are better than what they came to the table with in Copenhagen is a reflection of the fact that globally the climate movement and the climate justice movement is getting stronger and is significantly stronger since Copenhagen. And this is something that's not just true, you know, in the United States, for instance, where you've seen the rise of movements taking on pipelines like Keystone XL. The anti-fracking movement, you know, is so strong that they got fracking banned in New York State, just as you've had fracking banned here in France. It's a very different kind of movement than the movement that we saw in Copenhagen in 2009, which was very professionalized NGOs, all about the back rooms. This is a movement that's very much in the streets, and it's not just about the global north. I think the movement in China that has risen up in the face of suffocating air pollution is the reason why China is coming to Le Bourget with a commitment to cap emissions, which they didn't do and were refusing to do in Copenhagen. So we're in better shape than we were in 2009, but it's still not good enough. We're starting from so far behind that we've got a lot of catching up to do. So if you add up all of those targets that governments are coming to, it doesn't bring us to 2 degrees, which in and of itself is too dangerous. It brings us to more like 3 to 4 degrees Celsius warming. And these are numbers from the Tyndall Center on Climate Research. And this is catastrophic warming. I mean, 4 degrees, to quote Kevin Anderson, who's probably the world's leading expert on emission reduction, that's not compatible with organized civilization, as he puts it. So we can't call that success, but I think the movement is growing. And you know, hopefully the next time our politicians gather, they'll be under even more pressure to do more.
Jade.
Comme Naomi vous l'expliquait, nous sommes dans un moment dual où à la fois ces négociations sont en tant que telles incapables, pour plein de raisons, de déboucher sur un outil d'action réellement efficace contre le dérèglement climatique.
In order to combat climate change, but there are lots of things happening from finance, from the tax authorities, from the industry, and that's the reason why I would like to put this question to you. Your book
s'appelait This Changes
in English, This Changes Everything.
Ce qui est un petit peu différent
It's different
de
to
la
the French
traduction
translation.
Et ce que j'aimerais vous demander, c'est
you this
pourriez-vous nous donner deux exemples de choses qui ont déjà changé, qui soient significatives par rapport à notre discussion sur le climat.
Climate change.
So the question is, how is climate change changing everything? Or I'm not sure I totally understood the question.
Qu'est-ce qui a déjà changé, que ce soit dans l'économie, dans l'industrie, dans la manière peut-être de faire de la politique?
Doing politics because of climate, or because of climate change, or in response to climate change, because it's a dynamic process.
Yeah, it is dynamic, and the reason why I chose that title is because it has a double meaning, right? I mean, everything is going to change one way or another. 3 to 4 degrees Celsius means everything changes about our physical world. It's not too late to keep that from happening, but our current economic and political system seems incapable of doing so. And that's why if we want to prevent those radical physical changes to our world, then we need radical changes to our political and economic system. And I think you see that very clearly. I mean, the clearest example of this is at the beginning of this negotiation, the United States announces it can't be legally binding. Why can't it be legally binding? Of course it should be legally binding. What is the point of all of this if it isn't legally binding, if there aren't penalties? But everybody sort of accepts, well, of course it can't be legally binding because everybody knows that Obama can't bring it to the US Senate because the US Senate is bought and paid for by the fossil fuel companies. So this is one of the ways that climate change demands deep political change. In North America, it means that a corrupt political system needs to be radically changed, and the power of corporations over the political process is simply untenable with climate, with a safe future, because they're blocking us. They're blocking us at every turn. So that's one example. Another example is the logic of austerity is completely incompatible with climate action. I mean, here we are in Europe. And somehow the debates about austerity and the debates about climate change seem to take place in two different worlds, right? In one corner, you're having debates about Greece and Spain, and they're negotiating with Germany. Climate change almost never comes up, right? But it's intimately connected because all over Southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Italy have all cut their supports for renewables in the era of austerity. They have all increased fares for public transit. They're all in the midst of a fossil fuel frenzy in order to raise revenue. Italy plans to double its offshore oil drilling. Greece is being pushed to drill for oil and gas in their beautiful seas that are at the center of their tourism and fishing economies. So obviously, the logic of austerity and climate change are incompatible. So that's something that needs to change.
Si je peux me permettre d'ajouter,
allow
il y
me
a
to
le livre,
add something. There's the book, This Changes Everything, but there's something specific with your work.
Et ce qui lui donne, je pense, à résonance sociale aujourd'hui, c'est que vous ne vous êtes pas arrêté au livre.
Haven't only written a book, an internet site was created. There's a sort of movement that was created. This changes everything. This is a web address. Resistance movements, associations are combating fossil fuels. So there are different types of activists. It's a new type of activism, and they can post their information, their videos, their actions, and they can make themselves known as part of discussion of your book, but they can also echo the activist movement. Why was it important to come up with this type of platform at the crossroads of journalism and activism?
Well, I think part of it is just that I've been kind of lucky in my writing life that my books have tended to come out in these movement moments and have become just kind of organically tools for social movement. So my first book, No Logo, came out just as the protests in Seattle against the World Trade Organization were happening, and the book sort of was swept up in the movement. And so, and something similar happened with the shock doctrine because it came out right before the bank collapse in 2008. So it became a tool for the anti-austerity movement. So I think with this project, I just wanted to be a little bit more deliberate about it because it's usually just quite ad hoc. But the other really different thing is that we did a film as part of this too, a documentary film. My husband, Avi Lewis, as I was writing the book, he was making the film. So we saw it as three distinct projects, right? The book, the film, and then engagement, basically the ideas in the real world, right? But we didn't just want a website that was, links to a bunch of different groups, although we have that too. We wanted the website to be a place where the ideas continue to be debated, where people come together. But also, it's not just about the website. I mean, what we have found, particularly with the argument I'm making about the connection between climate change and austerity, refugee rights, women's rights, that it does change everything if we're going to take this crisis seriously, is that we have a problem, particularly in North America, maybe less so in France, where social movements have become extremely compartmentalized. Or we call it silos, right? So you have a lot of people working on a lot of different fronts. There's great things happening with social movements in North America, but there's not nearly enough dialogue and cooperation between the movements. So what we have found since the book came out is that I call us a political pop-up, because somehow it's provided a neutral space for movements to come together and talk to each other. And I say neutral, not because obviously I'm not neutral, I mean, my Twitter bio is they say I'm polarizing, but neutral in the sense that, if Greenpeace invites a union to talk, that starts, it comes with a lot of baggage. And for whatever reason, this Changes Everything brand, if you like, has been helpful to be organized convenings, things like this. So some of them we've organized, but some of them people have just organized on their own. In the UK, they had a This Changes Everything convening that we had nothing to do with. I Skyped in and said hi, but it was organized by people I didn't know, and it was great. It brought together labor, refugee rights, climate. So we need those spaces, that connective tissue, and that's just happened organically. We didn't know that that was what was going to be most useful, and what we've learned is that's what we need. We need spaces to come together.
Justement, je voyais
I had a look at the video blog with Jade, with Mediapart on Sunday, the 29th of
Paris, et vous dites en gros,
November,
voilà, c'est presque vide aux alentours de la place de la
on the
République,
streets of Paris,
parce que évidemment la
the Place de la
manifestation
République
a
is
été
empty
interdite pour
and
cause
the
d'état
demonstration
d'urgence,
was
alors que
prohibited
vous
because
dites,
of the state
nous
of
aurions
emergency.
peut-être été
And
un
you said
million,
that
peut-être que nous aurions
maybe
battu le
there would
record
have
de
been
New
1
York,
million
je crois, pour une
people,
manifestation
so better
climatique.
than
Il y
New
aurait
York.
dû y
So
avoir ce jour-là à Paris,
on
ce
this
dimanche-là,
Sunday,
peut-être
maybe
1
there
million
would
de
have been 1
personnes.
million
Est-ce
people.
que vous
Do you
considérez
consider
que
that
cet
the
état
state
d'urgence
of
qui donc a
emergency
été
that has
décrété
been
par
stated
la
by
France
France
après
after
les
the
attentats
attacks
et les
and
meurtres
the
du 13 novembre
attacks
dernier
and the
fait partie de
the
ce
attacks
que vous appelez la stratégie du
Friday
choc?
the
Vous
13th.
considérez
Do you think that
que
this
c'est
is
quelque chose dont on peut
the
dire, voilà,
shock
c'est
doctrine?
la
And
réponse
can
des
you say
États
that this is
pour
the
empêcher
response
les
of
gens de
states, I mean, to prevent
s'organiser
people
à des
from
événements qui
organizing
sont bien
themselves
sûr
and taking
réels
part in
et
real
incontestables,
and
mais ce
genuine
n'est pas une
events, but
réponse
it's not
pertinente et ça
a
fait partie
relevant
de cette
answer?
fameuse
And do you think
stratégie
that
du
it's
choc?
part of the shock doctrine?
I think it certainly fits this pattern that we saw after September 11th, where in these moments of shock and crisis, the state moves in and rolls back civil liberties, privacy, and in France's case, the right to assemble in the streets. And but I found it particularly shocking that there has been this blanket ban on protests, because that's something that even George Bush didn't do after September 11th. So, I do think it is part of it. And this is not to say that there is no security problem. Of course there is a security problem. But that is such an extraordinary measure. As I said, something that even George Bush didn't do after September 11th. And, I remember that, that New York hosted Davos, the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, was held in New York that year in solidarity with New Yorkers. And there were protests. They didn't ban protests. I mean, there were restrictions, certainly, but a blanket ban, to me, is shocking. And, coming into the city and seeing, I think a combination for me, as an outsider, I should say, the combination of that ban with the Christmas shopping and that festival of consumption that is this season, and that being in full swing, felt particularly chilling, right? Because it's sort of like freedom is just the freedom to shop, and that echoed to me what George W. Bush said after September 11th, just go shopping, right? But in this case, it's literally like all you can do is go shopping. And so I was glad to see that people took to the streets despite this, and I think we're gonna see this. We're gonna see more of it. I think it takes time for people to get their courage back.
Il y a quelques jours,
Jade.
pardon. Il y a la latence de la traduction qui
Ça y
fait
est, tu
qu'on
peux y
a
aller.
un petit
So it's because of translation.
décalage. Pardon. Il y a
So
quelques jours,
a few
vous
days
avez
ago, you
participé
took
à
part
un
in
événement militant
an activism-based
dans le cadre du village
event
des
at
alternatives,
Montreuil
le sommet des peuples
to
pour le
save
climat.
the peoples.
C'était le procès
So
du pétrolier
Exxon
Exxon Et ce qui nous
was in the
rappelle
dock,
que
so to
on a,
speak.
récemment
Recently, we
découvert
discovered
que,
that Exxon
connaissait
was
la réalité,
aware
du
of
changement
the
climatique,
reality of climate
de ses
change
causes,
and its
liées à
payoffs
l'activité humaine
and its
depuis
causes.
des
And for
années
many
et des
years,
années, et avait
and
en
Exxon
conscience
financed
financé de la
research,
recherche climato-sceptique, financé de la
financed
communication
communication in order to hide this reality
du changement
of climate change,
et que des
and
millions
millions
de
of dollars were spent
pour
on
cela.
that.
Et d'ailleurs,
And
Exxon n'est
Exxon
pas
is
la
not
seule
the
only
energy fossil company to have done that. We
voit
know,
énoncer, on
and
découvre
we've
finalement,
discovered
mois après mois,
month after month
l'ampleur
the
des
extent
masses d'argent
of the amounts of
dépensées
money
par cette
spent
industrie,
by this
pour
industry in
littéralement
order to
faire
put
pression
pressure
sur la
on
recherche,
research,
faire
to
pression
put
sur
pressure on
l'information,
information,
et ainsi,
and
contribuer
they
à une
contribute
sorte
to
de,
what I would call
d'opacité,
an
finalement,
opaque system
autour du climat, et ce qui a
regarding
rendu
climate.
pendant des
So
années
for many years,
difficile
it was
les
very
discussions sur
difficult
le
to
changement
get some
climatique,
discussions
parce que tout
around
simplement,
climate change
l'information
because
ne parvenait pas,
information was not
jusqu'au grand
forthcoming
public.
to the public at large. So allow me to put this question to you. In the face of all these means and resources that have been mobilized in order to hide the reality of climate change, but these tactics will be used through advertising. So for all these industries facing a vital challenge.
Face à ça, vous faites partie des personnes
you are
qui
among
veulent
the
développer un
people who
contre-récit.
want to tell a counter-narrative. So we need to tell something else. The oil companies have a narrative, so we need to embark upon a counter-narrative. But there's a gap of resources, the millions of dollars and the climate change movements. Can you tell me how do you work, in which conditions, I mean, which conditions have to be met in order to develop a counter-narrative in the face of the big communication means of the big groups?
So, I mean, first of all, that people's trial of Exxon, it was, you know, it felt intensely connected to what's going on at Le Bourget. We were not in Le Bourget. We were in the alternative space, but you know, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the biggest problem we have in these negotiations is that the United States is coming to the table saying it can't be legally binding. And that has everything to do with what the obstructionism of these fossil fuel companies. So even if Exxon now claims that they're no longer funding climate change denial think tanks like the Heartland Institute that are actively, you know, trying to spread doubt about the science, they're still funding politicians who deny climate change and who block every attempt to do something about it, right? So this is not, we're not just doing, you know, an autopsy. We're not just looking at something that was happening in the past. We are still living the influence of this industry. Exxon made more profit than any company in the history of the world, $42 billion in a single year. They've done it twice in the past decade. You know, and for me, I'm sort of obsessed with that, you know, because I think this is the money that we need to pay for the transition off of fossil fuels, the mess that was made by this industry. We know that they knew about climate change, right? And we know that they have stood in the way of progress. And here we are, our governments say, well, we can't do anything because we're broke. You know, how are we going to pay for, you know, to make a public transit better and free in a time when, you know, the French government couldn't even pay to put on the COP. They had to bring in corporate sponsors, right? So, so we need that money. And so this process of delegitimizing the business model, which the fossil fuel divestment movement is a part of. And I think this is partly an answer to your question of, you know, how do we take this on? I think the fossil fuel divestment movement is taking it on, and it isn't just about the money. It isn't just about, you know, getting, you know, this foundation or this school to announce that they're selling their fossil fuel shares. It's that every time somebody makes the argument for why we should divest, they're making an argument that these profits are not normal, that it's not normal to have a business model that is structurally at war with life on Earth. It is not, those profits are illegitimate. Now, if they're illegitimate, then they can no longer simply flow into the pockets of shareholders and executives. We have to find a way to get a larger share of those by the state, whether it's increases in royalties, whether it's nationalization. We have to do it because we have to pay for this somehow, and it has to be justice-based. And this is, I think when we talk about climate justice, we often talk about the justice of who is going to benefit, but it's also who's going to pay for it.
Ma question, c'est aussi.
Okay, so you were talking about the narrative and the counter-narrative with the example of the divestment, but in a very pragmatic way, how shall we do to make sure that people hear you with an alternative narrative, given such a huge, massive communication?
Well, alternative media obviously matters a huge deal, but I do believe that the deniers are starting to lose the argument, even in the United States, and part of this is just the power of the climate change movement, but also it's just reality, right? I mean, I think in the United States, Hurricane Sandy was a turning point. The fact that it hit New York City, it hit Wall Street, right? It hit the media centers. There is more coverage now. So we're in this strange moment where we are more like a majority of Americans now, are willing to entertain the possibility that climate change is real and so on, that humans are causing it. But what hasn't changed is the holdover politicians, and that's a bigger problem. But I think that divestment, like as we delegitimize these profits, the next stage, or we should be in this stage already, is it should not be morally acceptable for politicians to take fossil fuel money. I don't even think it should be it shouldn't be morally acceptable for media outlets to run their ads. And we're starting to see museums, like there was an action just yesterday at the Tate Museum in London, which is sponsored by BP, where there was an occupation. They've had a series of these events because British museums are all sponsored by fossil fuel companies, and this is becoming morally unacceptable in the same way that taking tobacco, tobacco companies used to sponsor the entire, arts world, and that became unacceptable. I don't know if it's still unacceptable in France, but in North America, you can't have that in the same way. I mean, tobacco companies used to sponsor all the sporting events, and they can't do that now. So we need to get it into the political sphere and also the media sphere.
C'est là, Naomi Klein, où vous dites évidemment que c'est un problème économique global, parce que ça pose la question du désengagement de l'État et des services publics. Là, vous faites allusion au musée anglais, par exemple, à la Tate Gallery. On pourrait considérer que le rôle de l'État est justement de subventionner ces établissements culturels et de ne pas le laisser faire aux compagnies pétrolières.
Yeah. And I mean, where it's really a crisis too is in public education, because public universities are so underfunded by the state that they turn to corporations to fill that gap, and fossil fuel companies have a huge amount of influence. And right now we're seeing this play out with Exxon. This investigation that is at the heart of the fact that Exxon may well end up in a very real court soon, and New York's Attorney General has subpoenaed Exxon, and they're under investigation for misleading their shareholders about their so-called climate risks, and misleading the public in the same way that the tobacco companies were challenged. This work was done by journalists at Inside Climate News, but also there was an investigation of the LA Times in cooperation with the Columbia School of Journalism, and dozens, I believe dozens of journalism students cooperated to go through thousands and thousands of pages of documents to unearth all of this. Well, what just happened last week is that Exxon wrote a letter to the president of Columbia threatening to pull its donations, right? Because like every university gets fossil fuel money. So you see, it's one of the more concrete examples. Usually this kind of thing happens, in ways that we never hear about. We don't hear about that behind the scene bullying, or the way in which I think the way academics self-censor is an even bigger problem, because I think that academics generally tend to know how to read the writing on the wall and know what will get them into trouble before they even do it.
Jade.
So we hear you, and we realize how significant it is to give the right information, and that it's a real challenge, especially with regard to climate change. It's a transversal problem, and it relates to economy, geopolitics, science, climate science. Quite concretely, how would you do to work on all these issues? You have researchers working all around you, and with those researchers you tend to cooperate. Could you please tell us very concretely how you do, how you proceed to try and take up this political challenge and fight about information?
Yeah, so I am really lucky to work with some wonderfully gifted researchers. One researcher in particular, Rajiv Sakora, he works with me full time. Yeah, he's the lead researcher on this book. He's here in Paris with me, following the negotiations, and he also edits the blog on the website, which is, as we were talking about earlier, this space for debate. So it's been great for him to be able to develop many of the ideas in the book with the key thinkers, theorists, and actors writing for themselves on the blog. But so I have a couple of researchers work on each book, and then when we get to the final crunch phase, we had to bring in a couple more researchers to fact check. I had 3 lawyers, very rigorous legal process. And then we also, on top of that, set up a sort of ad hoc peer review where, because the book, it crosses so many different sectors of, climate science, social science, psychology, sociology. We broke up the key areas of where you really need deep expertise, and we sent those sections to leading experts in the field. So, we were very lucky to have James Hansen, Michael Mann, Kevin Anderson, and Alice Bowes. Like, these are top-notch climate scientists, review all the science in the book, send us notes. So we set up our own little review process, because the last thing, I mean, my philosophy about the research, and I'm obsessed, is if you want to put radical ideas out into the culture, then you don't want to be taken down on any detail. Don't be radical on any detail, right? Be conservative about the details and be radical about the thesis. So with all the climate science, if anything, we go conservative. We don't go out there on a limb with the most sort of alarmist, scariest science. We go actually for the safest, because I don't want the thesis of the book to be brought down on a footnote, So we do that. That's the climate science. We do the same thing with trade policy. And I've been just really lucky that so many academics have been so generous with their time and just have been willing to, review the texts and notes. But, it adds a whole other stage to the process, obviously.
This is very interesting what you're describing, because we see to which extent, and thanks to the impact of your work, and thanks to the fact that you're famous, you've been famous in the course of years by the success of your books, that somehow you have almost become a media yourself. And your books, your articles, whether it's in Rolling Stone magazine or in The Guardian, they may be useful and act as a speaker for radical ideas and authors as well. And is it a way of cooperation and collectivism around you? You have a kind of community. Was it intentful, or did it happen gradually and in the course of years?
It's definitely been absolutely figuring it out as I go along, we don't get it right all the time. What I love most about the film, about the documentary film, This Changes Everything, is that it's a much more accurate reflection of the fact that my ideas are not my ideas. They emerge from this collective space. that is this amazing movement filled with so many brilliant thinkers who are my teachers, right? I mean, that book begins with a conversation that I had with a Bolivian trade negotiator, Angelica Navarro. You know, she gave me the idea for the book. I don't claim that these are my ideas, but the thing about a book is that as much as you know, as many people as you quote, and you know, every chapter begins with 3 quotes, and the book is filled with quotes from brilliant people, and my acknowledgments are 6 pages long of all the people who contributed ideas and books that influenced me. It's still one voice, you know. I mean, that's the thing about writing. You can quote people, but people are hearing my voice in their heads. And the film is completely different. You know, the film is not me giving a speech and just saying, you know, I've figured everything out, everybody listen. The film is a symphony of voices that reflects the fact that these are collective ideas and really reflects my learning process, which is that, you know, I had this wonderful privilege of traveling to some of these communities in deep, deep resistance, fighting for alternatives, and there's really no barrier between the actors and the intellectuals in this movement. There's just so many brilliant people who are on the front lines of struggle and are theorizing what this moment means. And so the film, in meeting those people, going to the communities, like people like Crystal Lehman of the Beaver Lake Cree Nation, who's really the heart and soul of the film. She's here in Paris representing her nation. It's just much more accurate. And my narration in that film is just kind of connecting the dots, underlining a few points, just doing what I consider the main thing I do, which is pattern recognition. Okay, this is similar to this, this is similar to this. So I love the film, and I'm very grateful to Avi for that, because I really do believe that that's more honest in terms of where these ideas come from than it is, just to write a single authored book. And I was so happy when I was talking to Crystal a couple of days ago. She told me that that when she walks around the Bourget, people keep stopping her and hugging her and stuff because they saw her in the film. Yeah.
Vous décrivez, vous venez de dire à l'instant la barrière s'estompe entre acteurs et intellectuels dans ces mouvements. À titre personnel, comment faites-vous pour tracer une ligne entre votre cerveau et vos activités de journaliste et votre cerveau et vos activités d'activiste? Parce que c'est pas si simple en même temps d'être à la fois dans la rigueur de l'information et à la fois dans la dénonciation.
There are downsides to not having had a job since I was 24. I don't have a pension. I don't get paid vacations, but I also really don't have to worry about that question because there's nobody I'm going to get in trouble with if I cross a line, or I can do what I want. I guess I have always. I love Eduardo Galeano's phrase at the beginning of Open Veins of Latin America when he talks about the border patrols, the people who patrol the borders between the disciplines and the roles. And he, says that he crosses those borders with impunity. And, I adored Eduardo, and I try to also cross those borders with impunity. But the only thing I would just say is that, I used to call myself an activist journalist, but the truth is that it's sequential in the sense that when I'm writing, I'm really just writing. It requires a huge amount of disengagement to write a book that long with that much research. It took 5 years, and during those 5 years, I mostly said no to people asking me to do activist things. I stayed on the board of 350.org, and that connected me to the climate movement, and that was very important. And I wouldn't have been able to just disengage from the issue because I felt it so urgently. But besides that, it was really literally hiding away, in a very remote part of British Columbia and doing the writing. And then when it's done, then it's the activism, then it's the campaigning, then it's the engagement. So it's not so much like that. I actually find it difficult to do both at the same time. I'm not doing that much writing right now. I'm mostly being an activist.
Parce que c'est pas simplement, on comprend bien, en effet, vous avez une liberté d'intervention du fait d'être une auteur autonome quelque part. Mais je pose la question, c'est aussi par rapport à la réception de ce que vous dites. Et qu'on voit bien comment le fait que précisément vous soyez impliqué dans des mobilisations, que ce soit contre l'oléoduc Keystone XL aux États-Unis, mais dans bien d'autres batailles, cette implication personnelle
this personal involvement is used by some people
to discredit you. They contradict you
and they say why should we believe what she's writing as we know that her viewpoint is fully biased and she's an activist. Do you think that you should not be impressed by this, or maybe there is an element of truth? What do you think of that?
But I think that this is why I'm so rigorous about the research, right? Okay. And I feel like, you know, if the research stands, you know, if the book has been out for more than a year and, you know, and we haven't been challenged on a single significant fact, you know, then people will always look for something to discredit you with. You know, I was arrested protesting the Keystone XL pipeline, and I was arrested alongside a leading climate scientist, Jason Box, who's here in Paris. James Hansen was arrested as well. And you know, in academia, they deal with the same thing. I mean, both of them and any climate scientist who has joined the climate movement faces the same thing of, well, your research won't be credible if you you know, are also joining this movement. And their response is, you know, how can I not act in the face of this research? Like, how can I research the end of the world and not try to stop it, right? You know, we're not robots. We live in this world. There isn't a special planet reserved for journalists and climate scientists. So, you know, maybe part of it is just this issue. I mean, I had never been arrested. I mean, it's embarrassing, but I had never been arrested for political reasons until the Keystone protests. And another thing, I guess, that has made it a little bit easier is I'm working so closely with Bill McKibben in 350. I've never been as involved in a group as I am in 350. Previously, you know, I just like, yeah, I'll speak at a fundraiser or I'll support, but I've never, you know, been as intimately involved in terms, you know, I'm on the board. You know, it's a group I'm really a part of. You know, and I think part of that is because Bill is also a writer. You know, that Bill is, you know, one of the founders of 350. It was a group that he founded with a group of students at Middlebury College, where he's a professor, and I think Bill and I, even though we don't have exactly the same political views. What we share is that we are both writers who came to the conclusion fairly early on that books don't change the world, movements do. You know, Bill wrote the first book about climate change for a general audience 20-some years ago, The End of Nature. And you know, he was following all the journalistic rules, and he was, you know, he had the best job in the world. He was at the New Yorker, you know, just given free rein to write 10,000-word articles and travel around the world. And you know, he came to the point where he realized he could write books for the rest of his life about climate change, and that was not going to change it. It was going to be movement building. But that said, I believe that because 350 is a group that was founded by a writer, there's a way in which it sort of is a more comfortable place for writers and journalists. Like it is a group founded by a journalist, and I think that's significant. I mean, the fact that it's called 350, like this very wonky, researchy name, and the fact that the divestment movement was kicked off by an article written by Bill called "Do the Math," right? I mean, it's a group that is all about research and science, and so it feels like a comfortable place for me. I still don't like marches all that much.
Jade.
Peut-être que je peux juste en préciser 350. Pourquoi ça s'appelle 350?
It refers to 350 ppm of CO2 into the atmosphere.
Qui était historiquement
that
donné
was
par
the ceiling,
le seuil
the
de
concentration ceiling of CO2 not to overshoot. in order not to trigger off climate change. When 350 was created by Bill McKibben at that time, it was a target. It was an objective to avoid, but we have overshot this target. We are in the danger zone of climate change. Between last year and this year, so we are above 400 ppm. It was a target not to overshoot, but it has turned out to be a figure that we need to come back to. So it does bear witness to climate change.
On a toujours envie de vous poser la question, pour résumer votre livre, vous écrivez cette phrase, le système économique et la planète sont en guerre l'un contre l'autre. C'est la phrase la plus simple et la plus évidente pour résumer votre livre. Mais est-ce qu'il n'y a pas une trop grande différence, une imperméabilité entre l'activisme que vous représentez et les partis politiques traditionnels? Je prends le cas de la France. En ce moment, c'est la COP21. On va encore en parler pendant tout le temps de la COP21. Mais là, dans une semaine après les élections régionales, on va entrer dans la campagne présidentielle qui va durer un an et demi. Or, une phrase aussi simple que celle-là, dire qu'il y a la guerre entre notre système économique et la planète, je suis à peu près sûr que pendant les 1 an et demi de campagne présidentielle, on n'en entendra absolument jamais parler, très peu parler, ou en tout cas pas assez parler. Comment réduire cette distance entre l'activisme, presque le contre-lobbying que vous proposez, et les démocraties traditionnelles avec les partis politiques qui sont censés représenter les idées?
Yes, that's certainly a challenge. You know, we just went through an election in Canada. We just finally replaced our very right-wing government of Stephen Harper. We now have, you know, a very likable young Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Everybody keeps congratulating the Canadians because they're so relieved. And that we get to feel like good guys again. But the truth is that during the entire election campaign, climate change was a footnote, and all of the parties, the major opposition parties, were just arguing about which pipeline they were going to build. Nobody was taking the climate science seriously that says that we have to keep the vast majority of the oil in Alberta underground. And there was one candidate, a journalist actually, who turned into she's a great journalist named Linda McQuaig, and she was on a talk show, and she said, some people think, or a lot of people think, we have to leave that oil in the ground. And it was like the media had an absolute breakdown because a candidate had said this, and you just can't say this. And it was this incredible moment of disconnect because she's, you know, it's not some people, it's climate scientists who say that. There was, you know, a peer-reviewed article, a paper in Nature magazine that had said exactly that, and yet she wasn't even allowed to speak about its existence. So one thing that we did in Canada is, you know, we helped launch a manifesto that we called the LEAP Manifesto, precisely because there was such a gap between the physical reality, what is physically necessary, and what is considered realistic, pragmatic, within the very narrow confines of electoral politics, right? So rather than just accept those parameters, we hosted this meeting, our team, our political pop-up, hosted a meeting of 60 movement leaders, and we came up with a document that said, okay, if we take the climate science seriously, how do we get to 100% renewables in 2 decades for electricity and get the entire economy clean by mid-century? How do we do it in a way that fights inequality, that brings justice to First Nations? You know, we just sort of dropped it in the middle of the election campaign, to quote one newspaper, like a hand grenade, and it was great because you know, the parties had to respond. Mostly they responded by, you know, freaking out, but you know, it did at least insert these issues into the debate, and I think it's a good model because we can't let elections pass without physical realities intruding.
Jade?
On peut peut-être dire maintenant qu'on va arriver à la fin de cette première séquence.
We are nearing the end of the first sequence.
la présence à Paris du fait de la COP21.
Because of COP21, there are lots of activists, thinkers, intellectuals and researchers. And this is one of the beneficial effects of this international conference. Lots of stakeholders, lots of people involved in climate change. So in a few minutes' time, we will be joined by Kumi Naidoo. He's the Executive Director of Greenpeace International. And he's one of your friends.
Naomi, et que nous allons vous inviter à
you will have a discussion with him in a few seconds.
Voilà.
So he's just behind me. He will pop in very shortly.
Peut-être encore une question.
Naomi, another
question. Ce que vous appelez l'extractivisme,
extractivism, it's a philosophy whereby fossil energies should be exhausted and we need to dig until the end of times. Do you think that some progress has been made? 1 month ago we talked about COP21 with Jan and we pondered over the alternative scenarios and the impact on our way of life. Do you think that your ideas have made headway, have progressed on this front?
I think the climate movement is progressing. I think there are huge factors that have changed since Copenhagen. And the most significant perhaps is what's happened in Germany with the very rapid rise of renewables, having the largest economy in Europe shift so quickly. So now that more than 30% of its electricity is coming from renewables, this means that so much of what we've heard about it being impossible, unreliable, that we have to go with the mega projects, whether it's nuclear or mega dams, all of these arguments have just been exploded by reality, because not only is it possible to power large economies with renewables, but it turns out that decentralized renewables are more efficient, can be rolled out faster than these very centralized, very expensive, prone to corruption mega projects. So I think that's one example of how we're winning the argument with reality, don't you think, Kumi?
Alors, est-ce que vous êtes d'accord avec elle? Kumi Naidoo, bienvenue dans cette émission. Vous arrivez à peine. Est-ce que vous êtes d'accord avec ce que Naomi
said?
Yeah, we have momentum now to make the transition from an economy driven by dirty brown fossil fuel-based energy to an economy that's driven by clean, green, renewable-based energy. I think, Naomi's new best friend in the world is His Holiness the Pope, who is...
I have never met him.
But still, we all feel like... I think the encyclical of the Pope is pretty groundbreaking. And, I have... when the old Pope was there, I was in Rome some years ago when I went to campaign for the nuclear referendum, and I said, I challenge the Pope and all the religious leaders to come before us and say to people who believe that God exists, to say, folks, do you think God is so crazy and so cruel? Because if God supposedly knew humanity would need energy, you think God scratched his head and said, they're going to need energy, so let me take the coal and put it deep in the ground, the oil deep in the ocean, and the gas similarly, when clearly we should be looking up and see that primarily, wind and sun has been there that we've not been using. Of course, you have to be careful because somebody will tell you that geothermal is also renewable energy and that comes from below. But the bottom line is we must ask ourselves why the extractive industry continues to be so dominant. And I think it is a statement on democracy, because I think too many of our political leaders are in the pocketbooks of fossil fuel industry. Today you can describe the United States as the best democracy money can buy. And if you unpack which sectors of the economy buys that influence and controls decision-making in the United States, it's oil, coal, gas, nuclear, military, and other polluting industries.
And the banks that finance them.
Absolutely, and the banks that finance them.
Jade.
Alors, Kumi Naidoo, on est vraiment ravis de vous recevoir
so we're delighted
ce soir.
to welcome you tonight. We wanted to invite you today. Why? Because You've been talking about climate justice. What is climate justice? What is the meaning of this demand, climate justice? What does it mean?
Well, let me address two concepts, climate justice and a concept that we don't talk too much about, which is climate apartheid, because they're connected. Today, if you look at the people that are losing their lives from climate impacts, the people who are being brutalized by climate impacts, the 20 million people in Pakistan who have been displaced by one major flood, the people of Darfur in Sudan, where Lake Chad has dried up and that's led to conflict and so on. It is sad to see that the people that are paying the first and most brutal price are the ones that have been least responsible for carbon emissions. But what is uncomfortable is that, in fact, if you look at the demographic picture of which parts of the world are most responsible for carbon emissions and which parts of the world are paying the first price, it is a very uncomfortable picture, because most of the people that are dying now, paying the price, are people of color. In the climate negotiations now, there's a big fight between should warming be at 1.5 degrees or should it be 2 degrees? Now, many most vulnerable countries and most of the civil society groups like Greenpeace and so on are saying it should be 1.5 degrees. If you make the choice of 2 degrees, essentially you are saying that people in small island states, in least developed countries, in the coastal parts of Bangladesh and so on, their lives really don't matter, because the choice to actually allow warming to go above 1.5 degrees is actually condemning those people to death. So what we are, when we're talking about climate justice, we are saying that the people, those countries that carry the biggest responsibility should support those countries that carry least responsibility through financing three things. One is to enable them not to follow the same dirty energy pathway that rich countries follow to build their economies. Two, to help them to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And three, to help them with the loss and damage that they are suffering, like in places like the Philippines. And I should just say one exciting thing that has happened while we've been here in Paris is that in the Philippines, the first major climate litigation against the top 40 oil, coal and gas companies has started. The Philippines Human Rights Commission has accepted a case which they will announce on the 10th of December, which is International Human Rights Day, where they are going to start investigating all the big coal, oil and gas companies that have contributed to the terrible climate catastrophes that the people of the Philippines have been experiencing over the last couple of years. So that is all, in my judgment, part of the understanding of climate justice.
Jad.
Jad, you've said something strong, a strong word. Climate apartheid. Do you make a link, a connection with the fight against apartheid, especially when you were a student, and the fight against climate change?
Yes, but let me start with what I said strong, and I ask you a question.
Okay.
Do you think we will be having such a difficult problem in the negotiations now if Europe was experiencing the threat of sea level rise like the people in the Pacific are experiencing right now? Do you think we would have such a difficulty of trying to get 1.5 degrees as a cap if all of Canada and the United States were experiencing climate-induced drought like what we are facing in Africa right now? You know, it is clear that we live in a world where still black lives do not matter as much as white lives, right? And that is a fact that is playing itself out in the negotiations, but nobody is prepared to actually say it and call it as it is. And it makes me unpopular to say that, but I do so with absolute confidence that this is a right analysis, and the subliminal racism that exists in the world today is something that we have to actually accept, and the climate negotiations is a very, very good indication of it. But to your question, I think most of what I've done at Greenpeace over the last 6 years that I've been here has been very inspired by what I learned from the anti-apartheid movement. The important thing is the scale of the problem of climate catastrophe means that we have to work in alliances. NGOs cannot win it alone, trade unions cannot win it alone, religious organizations cannot win it alone, progressive business cannot. So the one key lesson is to build the largest possible alliance that must have impact. So that's one thing about alliances. The second thing that I learned from the anti-apartheid struggle, but not only from the anti-apartheid struggle, but from the struggle against slavery, colonialism, women's right to vote, civil rights in the United States, and so on, is all those struggles teach us that when humanity faced a big challenge or a major injustice, those struggles only moved forward when decent men and women stood up and said, enough is enough and no more. We're prepared to go to prison if necessary. We're prepared to put our lives on the line if necessary. Nelson Mandela gave 27 years of his life in prison. When you think about it, it's extraordinary. But many other people in our country had to make those sacrifices. And right now, given the scale of the threat of climate change, and some people don't like it when I say this, but I would say the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is bigger than all the other struggles put together, because this is not about saving the planet, because actually the planet does not need saving, because if we continue on the pathway that we are, we will warm up the planet to the point where we will be gone as human beings. The planet will still be here. It will be bruised, battered, and scarred by humanity's crimes on it. And in fact, the truth be said, if human beings become extinct, the forests will grow, the oceans will recover, and so on. So let's be very clear. This struggle is about whether humanity can fashion a way to coexist with nature in a mutually interdependent relationship for centuries and centuries to come. Put differently, this struggle is fundamentally about protecting our children and their children's futures. And given how much is at stake, if we were prepared to make the sacrifices to fight apartheid in one country, to fight civil rights in the United States and so on, we should have a sense of courage that is multiplied. You know, you take all the courage that we saw in all the different struggles, we have to take that courage and multiply it many, many times over. And that's one of the key lessons I take from the anti-apartheid struggle. The other thing I would say is I think that people are frustrated. Lots of young people have lost faith in our political leaders and so on. But I urge them, one of the lessons I've learned from the anti-apartheid struggle, tempting as it might be to engage in violence, I would appeal to all those who are thinking about using violence in the, to get the message across, that violence actually does not help us get where we are, because what happens is it's tactically wrong, it's strategically wrong, and it's ethically wrong. Because when we have peaceful marches and just a small number of people might break some windows and so on, what will happen is the corporate control media will focus just on the few people who broke the windows, and then the message gets lost. So those are some of the lessons that I've drawn from the anti-apartheid struggle, which I think are still relevant today in the climate struggle.
Jade.
En même temps,
at the same time, in Europe, in the 80s, there was an anti-apartheid movement, which was a major movement, and a whole generation became politicized, and the generation took care of South Africa. The comparison is cruel today, given the climatic change and challenge, because indeed there are some communities here and there, activists, and Naomi is talking about it in her book, but it is difficult to say that all those movements represent one single movement at that stage, and there is, on the one hand, you have this huge challenge with the climate change, its force, its violence, and a social mobilization which is still limited. So you're saying there is a structural reason, which is the one of racism. It's probably right, but don't you think that there is another dimension, the difficulty somehow to get mobilized against oneself, because here that's the Western way of life.
De nos deux invités, Naomi Klein.
Naomi Klein.
Well, first of all, I just would like to say that it's moments like this that I really feel sad that Kumi is leaving Greenpeace in 2 weeks. Because really, it's been extraordinary to watch Greenpeace change under Kumi's leadership, and you know, it's one of the really concrete things that we can see. Just, you know, this is not just words, right? In the fight that really came to a head in this past spring and summer against Arctic drilling. You know, Greenpeace was at the forefront of that, but it was a very different Greenpeace, because we always associated Greenpeace in the past with, you know, these very daring, a little bit macho stunts, you know, and it was like, it was activism, but it was just like a pretty small group of people who did something. And now they still do that, but you know what happened when Shell's rigs came and parked in Seattle and in Portland, Oregon, and I laugh because these were the worst cities they possibly could have chosen, because they're very, very, you know, the greenest places, you know, in North America, huge militant environmental movement. This is, you know, where Earth First was born, right? And so they parked there and were surrounded by hundreds of kayaks. But it was really different because although Greenpeace was leading, it was also following the communities. These were protests that were led by Indigenous people in Seattle. It was an incredibly racially diverse coalition in a very unequal city, making the connections with you know, gentrification, Bill Gates's fossil fuel investments. I mean, it was really, really interesting and a real shift. I think the biggest problem in Europe is somehow, and I just don't understand it, I think the biggest reason why we're not seeing this kind of thing in Europe is because Europe is in the grips of austerity, and in the midst of the economic crisis, people somehow just can't focus on the environment. But I really think that this is a failure of the left, you know, and a failure, you know, even of some of the new political parties. To hear the leader of Podemos say people can't care about climate change while they have to worry about putting food on the table, that is a failure of imagination, and that's a failure of leadership. Because what we need our leaders of the left to be saying is, we can solve these problems at the same time. We can create more jobs, we can create a fairer economy, we can put food on the table by investing in affordable public transit, energy efficiency. We can create hundreds of thousands of jobs, as Germany has done. How is it possible that these conversations are kept so separate in Europe? I need somebody to explain this to me. I don't think it's you know, a lack of sympathy. Maybe it's, you know, narcissism, but I think that the biggest problem is this split between economy and the environment, because you even hear that people can't care about their environment locally, right? And you know, terrible things are happening to the environment in Greece and Italy, and it's like the economy swallows up everything else.
Can I say something to Naomi?
Fin de la traduction.
Kumi Naidoo. So, Naomi, I just want to clarify. Okay. I'm not leaving Greenpeace.
Okay.
Right? So I am leaving a very important position at Greenpeace called the Executive Director of Greenpeace International to take on what I think is a much more important title that we have at Greenpeace, which I had before I came, and that of volunteer. And that is, I think it's a very important thing to say that all our movements, you know, the strength of Greenpeace is not in the full-time staff of Greenpeace. You know, the full-time staff are amazing, they do great stuff. But all our movements, whether it's Greenpeace, whether it's 350, whether it's, you know, ATTAC, you know, any other progressive organization, this is a time when we actually have to celebrate the role that people who participate in movements, who actually don't do it full-time, they have other jobs and so on. So, you know, I'm also, you know, I take your point and I think you're very kind to say that. But I think, you know, 5th of December, just yesterday, I guess, was the International Day of Volunteers. And I feel that right now, all our movements will benefit from creating more voice for volunteers, more space for them to participate more actively in decision making and so on, something which is an unfinished journey within Greenpeace, and I hope we will get there. But the important thing about the moment that we're in right now is that we have to generate what at Greenpeace we are calling 1 billion acts of courage. That in fact, we need to get larger numbers of people to campaign together with us, and courage means different thing in different contexts, right? You know, if you are a blogger in Syria, for example, in some countries they might call it slacktivism and clicktivism and so on. But if you're a blogger in Bangladesh or Syria right now, you're putting your life on the line. In Bangladesh, bloggers are getting killed and so on, for example. But this is a moment that calls for courage like we've never seen before.
Jade.
A final question, yes, because we are reaching the end of the program. This question is important, and we can come back to the COP21 and the summit on climate to come out of poverty. The rich countries, or the less advanced, sorry, the poor countries, the developing countries say that they need development, and that's the whole discussion. Which type of development do we need to come out of poverty? But it's not that simple, so simple to say today that pollution and the CO2 emissions are only defended by the rich countries. There are also poor countries defending their rights to grow and to develop and to have a CO2. And it's not to say that they are the guilty ones, but I mean that the situation is difficult, and the role of India in those negotiations, sometimes it is helpful, sometimes there is a blockage for legitimate reasons. I would like to hear about this right of the South countries to develop themselves, and what is the link with the climate justice?
There is no question that developing countries have an absolute right to actually take their people out of poverty. My own background, by the way, before I came to Greenpeace and climate activism, I was the chair of the global Make Poverty History campaign. I still wear the white band, which some people will remember from the 2005 campaign, right? I was the global chair of that campaign. But what kind of strategies we need to take people out of poverty? It makes absolutely no sense for our leaders to be saying that actually we will continue to burn carbon when right now in Chennai, in India, people have died in large numbers. The entire city is underwater as a result of climate impacts. We are saying absolutely the right to development, but let's do it the clean energy way, especially as Naomi said, that we can do it in a way where we don't only address climate, but we also can generate significantly more jobs in a clean, green economy. And the truth is, if you look at the numbers of jobs, even in big fossil fuel projects, and you compare it to the job creation potential in the renewable energy sector, we can, the studies show we can create much more decent jobs. And let's be clear, when you say you want to build your economy in coal, what are the consequences? You are wasting water, which we don't have to waste. You are causing air pollution, which is leading to respiratory illnesses and killing people that work in those industries and live around coal plants and so on. So I think it is when we now have the technology to deliver energy through clean means and generate jobs in the process, to cling to the idea that we must only build our economy through dirty energy means doesn't make sense. It doesn't, but to be fair, it is hard for developing countries like China and India and South Africa to back away from what is called cheap energy when the countries like Canada and US and Australia, who built the economies on dirty energy, are still wanting to continue with tar sands, and Australia wants new coal projects and so on. That's what makes it difficult. That it's hard for us to convince countries like India to walk away from fossil fuels when the countries that have put so much of carbon still are insisting on continuing you know, with so-called cheap energy. And let's be clear, it's not cheap. The consequences of what it costs our health system, what it does to water, what it does to agriculture, and so on, is actually very expensive. It's a fallacy to think that it's actually cheap in a true sense.
Naomi Klein.
Naomi Klein, the last word.
Well, I would just say that most of us understand that our governments, when they go to these negotiations, aren't representing us, but are rather representing the fossil fuel companies in large part. For some reason, we don't think the same thing about the Indian government, or the Chinese government. But they have just the same conflicts of interest. These are complex countries. This is contested terrain, and I think Kumi's point is absolutely key. The point is they're contested. They're some of the bravest anti-coal activists in the world in India and China. In China, this is activism with no freedom, with huge risks and penalties, but people are doing it anyway. And if we want to help, then what we need to do is we need to win in our own countries. We need to lead in our own countries, because when we allow our governments to do what they're doing now, which is shirk their responsibilities, it strengthens the hands of those forces in China and India and South Africa that are using this nationalism, it's our turn card, to line their own pockets in many cases. That's what we should be doing.
Merci beaucoup à tous les deux de nous avoir rendus visite. Merci à Jade d'avoir animé ce premier débat avec moi. On a eu un peu de mal à commencer ce soir, vous avez vu, vous avez entendu, ou plutôt vous n'avez pas entendu, mais on va se retrouver dans 32 minutes, enfin à 20h pile. On essaiera d'être à l'heure, sans aucun problème technique, pour les premières estimations de ce premier tour des élections régionales. Il me reste à vous dire, avant d'interrompre ce live, donc pendant une trentaine de minutes, que l'offre de la soirée, c'est 9 € pour Mediapart, mais non pas pour un mois, mais pour 3 mois. 9 €, 3 mois d'abonnement à Mediapart. Et il est tout chaud, il vient de sortir. Voilà, la revue du crieur, la seconde livraison. Ça sera offert aux 20 premiers abonnés. À tout de suite. Thank you so much.